Hello and welcome to another Iceberg video. Today we are going to talk about the best and worst of Monstercat in 2024. So overall, I would say that 2024 was a step down from last year. It was certainly a better year for the Instinct sub-label, and apparently the main reason why they had this sort of tech house influx last year was so that they could reach a wider audience and eventually hit 1 million subscribers, which I'm assuming happened last November given how different Instinct felt compared to the rest of that year. This year it seemed like Instinct was back to normal at a cost, because Uncaged was absolutely swamped with rhythm this year, not just in their tracks, but in a fair share of new acts. And sadly, that just seemed to overshadow everything else about this year. There were sporadically good months, but late in the summer it felt like Monstercat hit rock bottom, and they've been trying to make up for it since. So for those who haven't seen my ranking videos before, here are the rules. For both of my lists proper, there will be one track per artist, and it'll be Uncaged and Instinct originals only. I still haven't paid enough attention to Silk. I will give a quick shout out though to Life Force by BT and Shingo Nakamura. Also, my worst list this year is entirely Uncaged. That is how bad the lowlights were for them. This should probably go without saying, but keep in mind that this is just my opinion, and as Bowtie Media says, don't take it as gospel. So with that out of the way, let's talk about some dishonorable mentions. Brain on Drugs by AC Slater and Kirby featuring Nomi. A fair share of these are dishonorable mentions mainly because of the vocals, this being one of them. Also, I knew it was going to be tech house from the moment AC Slater was involved. Lock and Load by COD Dubs. I don't mind the droplet concept, but it simply got way too abrasive way too quickly. Nope by Cyclops. Comical ad-libs wasted by a monotonous and extremely repetitive rhythm drop. You Want Me by Dirty Phonics and Circadian. A promising break, but a really disappointing drop. The leads just sound poorly detuned, and there really isn't much that makes up for it. Foul by G-Rex and Stuka featuring Ice Cold Bishop. The rap has kind of grown on me, but the rhythm around the bass-oriented drop just sounds bland overall. Tempest by Infect. A prime example of offbeat rhythm, and it especially doesn't help that the offbeat elements are overbearing in the mix. Tax Evasion by Company. Once I understood more of Company's style, this track fell back on me, but I still think the second and third drops tend to lack some cohesion. Feel Again by Odd Kid Out and LED. Is it harsh to call this a watered down version of Invaders from Mars? I mean, the concept feels similar even down to its rhythm, and yet it squanders its potential and winds up being even less interesting. Bounce That by Riot 10 featuring Trigga Barbie. The trap is fine, but the lyricism is horrible. The last thing we needed on this label was a Sexy Red ripoff. And finally, Hardcore Rhythm by the Teddy Killers and MC Spida. Again, the vocal ruins this track for me. And for a Teddy Killers production, they get more of a push than they really deserve. And with that, it's time to talk about the top 10 worst Monstercat tracks of 2024. Number 10. There's some picks that I think should be fairly obvious. There are some other picks that I don't expect anyone else to have on their list. One track that was close to being an example of the latter was, in fact, You Want Me by Dirty Phonics and Circadian. It had some potential in the break, but was ultimately squandered by the drop. Feel Again by Odd Kid Out was a similar story and yet an easier target. But since those tracks at least had some potential to begin with, I've gone for this instead. Was anyone else excited to see Troy Boy debut on this label? I think I was expecting more of a minimalist hybrid trap production from these two artists, but instead we get a monotonous trap rap instrumental that goes absolutely nowhere. The drops are led by some bell chimes and an occasional flute, and the production around it is just very linear. There's a lack of tension and dynamics throughout this track, and it makes me question how this wound up in the label in the first place. Also, I'm not even sure what Troy Boy's involvement is in this track, especially since he's listed as a feature, which is weird. Now, from what I've heard, Yuzi might be releasing an EP on this label. I'm not sure which direction it'll go, but let's hope it isn't more of the same. Number 9. I had a feeling this artist would make my list. She made my dishonorable mentions last year, and while she did improve in her follow-up, I started to notice a trend of bass house tracks with breaks led by rap vocals. I thought it would be a massive risk heading into her EP, but in the end, she stuck with that trend, and we got this. The Star City EP was a bit of a dud, and this was the worst track from it. Sure, the drop was tolerable and packed more of a punch than War did, but it's hard to give credit to that when Southside Diddy just out the gates with a suggestive line, and really it was over before it even started. This was one track of many that was ultimately ruined by the vocals. And it's not just Southside Diddy's lyricism, as Nostalgics has some vocals of her own, which are partially auto-tuned for the purpose of I don't even know, and there's not a lot of chemistry between them, making her vocal involvement even more unnecessary. And it's ironic that they talk about acting like demons, because this song could use an exorcism. Number 8. Of all the artists on this list, I would say the leading artist here is the least deserving of being here. He provided the first long play album of the year and one of the largest of recent memory, and it provided more of a focus on experimentality. I'm not saying you shouldn't be experimental with your releases, but I will say not all of those experiments succeeded. There were not many collaborating artists I knew from the Mechanomorphic album, but Noir was one of them. I think some NCS fans might remember this guy from his 2022 track, Beam, a collaboration alongside Zenith and Gabriella that I think was widely criticized for its sloppy production, especially in the second drop. And I think I can already notice his influence here. The first drop I don't really have any problems with. It's nothing special, it kind of feels like a lead into the rest of the track, which absolutely falls apart in the second drop. And the problems here are twofold. First off, Mr. Bill's usage of vocal chops through this album has been fairly inconsistent. Catchy on occasion, but here it's pretty annoying. And on top of that, it's partnered with the worst of rhythm, as the offbeat elements make it a total mess. And while Mechanomorphic is a good album, this track has to be the worst of the bunch. Number 7. And here we have yet another track that isn't terrible comprehensively, but the elements that are bad are awful. Avance was a new arrival this year, and there's a part of me that's hoping he can redeem himself on this label. I wasn't so sure whether this deserved to make my list proper or just land as a dishonorable mention, mainly because the drops themselves are actually okay, far from the worst of the rhythm influx. We'll get to that eventually. So why exactly does this make my list? Well, I'm not gonna mince words. It's only here because of Koyet. Apologies if I mispronounced that. His sort of screamo I just cannot get behind whatsoever. It seems so forced and so abrasive, and it doesn't match up at all with a rhythm drop that tries to go for a minimalist approach. He's ruined Doom Den by Hi I'm Ghost, and he ruins this track as well. Safe to say this arrival left a lot of people I think you know exactly where this is going. Number 6. It's ironic that Infect had a track called Play It Twice, and somebody else played it the second time. Samplifier was also a new act to the label, technically arriving last year as part of the Thrones of Blood remixes. And I can't even give this a long introduction. This just feels like a throwaway for him. It isn't offbeat, that's all I can give it, but if there's one track that exemplifies being a Brittum template the most, it's probably this. The break feels like a fever dream. The elements here don't really make much sense, the transitions are way too short and lack any sort of tension, and in the drops the growls are pretty bland with a monotonous rhythm that just lacks intrigue. It simply doesn't bring anything new to the table. I could also make the argument that this was released at the wrong time, given everything else going on, and it's not even alone in that. Number 5. One thing I enjoy about watching other ranking videos, and the comments around it, is that I get to see a general sort of consensus around releases, both for Monstercat and for NCS. Now, I'm not always going to agree with that consensus, and that has been the case for the second year in a row with this duo. If this was released in a different month, you never know. Maybe the stance around it would be a different story. But I'll admit, I was pretty livid to see this track get a lot of acclaim. You know how we do this. What exactly happened with Have this year? I mean, Hideaway with Roy Knox was pretty great, but everything else felt mediocre at best. They followed up Hideaway with Pressure, a track that was close to making my dishonorable mentions, only for them to follow that up with this, and a really bad flow VIP. You see, Neurofunk is a genre that I've never really understood, and this track proves it. Because what even is this drop? There's just a lack of cohesion overall. I mean, the percussion's fine, but the growls sound like a sputtering lawnmower on occasion. That simply tends to overshadow everything else about this. Maybe it's best we just move away from this track and move on. Number 4. So the rest of this list was pretty tough to order, and 3 of the next 4 tracks are going to revolve around a particular topic I'd like to call the disciplification of Monstercat. If you thought the rhythm influx was bad last year, it became much more obvious this time around, mainly through their new acts. Now, this artist made his debut last year, and now I'm starting to question whether he was technically the one that started it all. The Canal Street Crook EP, while I don't think it's any good, it has grown on me a little bit since first listen. I do wish 14 Grams was more of a fleshed out unit, and the title track and Lock and Load were more frustrating than anything, with some moments of promise nullified by inconsistent percussion, much like Vitamin R, and some really abrasive elements. Facelift, though, had pretty much everything I didn't like about Dr. Ushu's Love Me last year. For this track, Cod Dubs brings along Decimate, who also hasn't had a good run of form on the Disciple label, and XAE, who's in charge of the break. The drop feels weaker in comparison to Vitamin R, and yet still feels just as obnoxious. Bland in its sound selection, and annoying in its timing. I was initially going to call it the biggest rhythm misstep that Monstercat had this year, and yet it's fallen to number 4 on this list. Again, that's how bad the Uncaged lowlights were this year. Number 3. But say what you want about Cod Dubs, turns out being offbeat isn't the only thing that makes rhythm obnoxious. In terms of arrivals I dreaded most, Infect was very near the top. I had to listen to the Veggie Friends EP and its remixes at the start of the year, and to this day I don't get the hype for this guy. If there's one thing I'll give him though, it's that I think he made the right decision having Goop as the uploaded single for the Veggie Games EP. Yes, there are some offbeat elements, but I think they actually work better with a trap-based rhythm in comparison to a more rigid Brittum percussion. That's probably why I didn't hate Invaders from Mars as much as others did. But the rest of the Veggie Games EP was pretty terrible. While Tempest had its own offbeat elements, Momentum somehow found a way to be even worse. The sustains are so random and abrasive at the same time with no sense of cohesion, and there's nothing elsewhere that makes up for it. What I especially don't like about this song and the EP as a whole is that there's a complete lack of atmosphere, and that pretty much forces you to focus on the elements you don't want to focus on. I guess that's the summary of Veggie Games, where everyone loses. Number 2. You have no idea how close this track was to taking my top spot. And if you want another example as to why trap rap simply doesn't belong here, I think DC Ranks puts it perfectly when he calls Whipped Cream one of the most unpredictable artists on the label. And on occasion, it has worked in her favor. But this year, it started off in the worst possible direction, with a trap rap song coated in auto-tune and narcissism. The lyricism is very repetitive throughout, and once the drop kicks in, I'll admit it left me in pure shock the first time I heard it. The auto-tune combined with the vulgar lyricism from 4-5 is near unlistenable. And what's more, the production just sounds like a generic trap rap template that brings absolutely nothing of note. It was dangerously close to being my least favorite Monstercat song this year, but it is certainly Whipped Cream's worst on the label. Number 1. As I said before, it was a difficult decision. I didn't expect it to be. I thought Who's Laughing Now would be the clear-cut worst track of the year. But for this pick, I've decided to be a little more holistic. Because with the artist in question, I initially had his title track in and around 7th on the list. I didn't realize how bad he would actually be. Hit them with that. Right at the ceiling. After introducing the Riot remixes early on, it seemed like the Uncaged label would take a turn for the worst with Riot 10's arrival. With his leading singles, I thought I'd give him the benefit of the doubt and put him on the lower half of this list at most, until the rest of the Feral EP came out. Now, 3 particular tracks felt deserving of this spot. Bounce That, Elbows to the Dome, and this. Now, why exactly have I gone for Bad Attitude here? Well, at least with tracks like Elbows to the Dome and Lock and Load, as sloppy as they are, there's an energy factor that can make it work for a Lost Lands or Rampage set. So what purpose is this drop even supposed to serve here? It tries to go for a minimalist production for absolutely no reason. The quacking elements make no sense, the warping bass and the cheap percussion, all of it's just confusing. If I could have an entire EP representing one spot, this would be one of the few times where I actually would. But at the end of the day, while Bounce That had some abysmal lyricism and Elbows to the Dome was really clumsy, Bad Attitude felt like the moment where Riot 10 just gave up. That is what makes it the worst Monstercat track of 2024. But now that that's out of the way, let's talk about the best tracks that Monstercat had this year. The same rules apply, so let's not waste any more time. Let's start with the honorable mentions. Do or Die by Bishu featuring Prop. The lyricism is dumb, but the production elsewhere absolutely makes up for it. It stands out from the rest of the micro-celebrity album due to its dreamy atmosphere. Data by Blank and Audia. Bass House had a pretty big year, mainly because some artists experimented around with it, Blank being one of them. It's simply a high-energy release, and the anime-based vocals I have absolutely no problem with. Somebody With You by Conroe. The moment where Conroe tries to impersonate Ellis with a sort of disco house production, it makes for a really fun and really catchy listen. Right Here, Right Now by Dirty Phonics. A similar story to Data, and a track that really caught me by surprise. And that really helped introduce their experimentality and interest in bass house heading into their album. Lush by Grant. A combination of drum and bass and a sort of retro synth pop that really makes it stand out. It probably makes the list proper for a lot of people, just like Somebody With You. That being said, the ending is a little out of place. Last Time by Jason Ross featuring Linny. It's an all-around highlight of Jason's Divergence EP, with a stormy house production and some pretty memorable lyrics from Linny. One of the few times where lyricism has actually worked in their favor. Don't Wanna Know by Ryan Case featuring Jake Newmar. If only the house influx of 2023 carried more stutter house like this. This track has been a hidden gem for quite some time. Despite not being all too extravagant, it simply lives and dies by its clean production and sound selection. Out of Frame by Skybreak, Sharks, and Luthien. A bittersweet moment for Sharks because not only is it his debut on the label, it also might be his very last release. With hints of color bass in and around an emphatic melodic dubstep production. AF1 by Thirst. If there was one genre I couldn't help but give credit to, especially as a raw style fan, it's hard techno. Powerful kicks combined with funk-based plucks because, well, it's Thirst after all, but just like a fair share of their other releases, maybe this one could have been longer. And finally, Star Destroyer by Virtual Riot. The bro step drop wasn't really that great, but the Jersey Club mixed in with Mongolian throat singing, I mean, who even does that? If that's not an example of thinking outside the box, I don't know what is. And with that, it's time to talk about the top 10 best Monstercat tracks of 2024. Number 10. So the first two picks on this list were pretty difficult to decide. I really had to double and triple check my honorable mentions for this, and let's not forget the one track per artist rule that narrows down my options even further. So from there, a lot of factors have to be taken into account, from the production to the timing of the release, in order to determine which tracks deserve to make this list. But remember when I said some picks would be pretty obvious? This one is absolutely not one of them. Yetep didn't have the greatest debut. Two tracks in particular that got a lot of criticism were his debut First Place, which had a pretty abrasive and whining lead, and his follow-up Daisies. While the drop I think was pretty good, the lyricism did feel a bit cliched for lack of a better term. But I've been paying attention to this guy outside of the label, and he basically reminded me of Arm & Hammer from last year. Initially rooted in melodic dubstep, but willing to experiment with some house music. And it's paid off here, with the drops providing some solid leads and vocal chops that help carry its energy. I like that they've gone for a strong sidechain in the drops as well. And another reason why this makes this list proper is Marley. She's been having her own redemption arc this year, and I think her vocals mesh well with the overall tone of this track. I'm not sure what to expect from Yetep at this point, but I'm hoping he can turn some more heads in his favor. Number 9. And on the topic of tracks straight out of left field, I wasn't as sold on No Mana's album as others were, but this one just clicked with me from the very start. The progression does feel a bit slow, but it feels like one of those mindless bops when it does get going. It's an example of doing more with less and making the most out of simplicity. I'm a fan of the minimalist percussion here. I think the plucks work very well, and so do the vocal chops as this drop progresses. What I like most about it is that I can absolutely see this being played in a main stage set. Just imagine someone like Tiesto or Oliver Heldens playing this live at Tomorrowland. The simplicity here is what makes it work so well for me. It's another one of those that a lot of people tend to overlook, but I think there's a garage door that's worth opening here. Number 8. On the other side of the spectrum, one artist, or in this case an alias that I had next to no expectations for, was Thirst, a recently introduced funk group currently consisting of Have and Roy Knox. And what they've proven this year, perhaps alongside a few others, was that funk works best in conjunction with other genres. Now this year, Thirst released a 20-track mixtape, but they already made this list even before then. This track surpassed every expectation I had of them simply by trying something different. Despite being advertised as a funk group, they have experimented with multiple genres over the course of this year, and here it's a combination of funk and melodic dubstep. The mood is a bit more melancholic here. The funk-based plucks are initially filtered out to match the ambience. It remains fairly calm throughout the break, and the dynamic change helps make the first drop hit much harder. A strong bass line and percussion combines with the aforementioned funk plucks and an overall darker sound selection. But my favorite part of this track has to be the second drop, a double-timed speed house switch-up that is just so replayable. It then goes back into the style of the first drop, but those breaks in between help provide more of a punch every time the drop kicks back in. It'll be very interesting to see where Thirst goes from here. Number 7. Remember when Bad Computer collaborated with a relatively unknown artist at the start of last year to make one of the best tracks of that year? Do I even need to tell you where this one's going? If there was one track that really helped kickstart this year's potential, it was this one. It might not be as memorable as Calling Us from last year, but it showcases Bad Computer at his best, providing an extremely catchy future house production alongside Ryan Koss. I'm a pretty big fan of piano house, and this track utilizes it pretty well in the break. There's an attention to detail within the fills and ear candies. The first drop utilizes Bad Computer's signature style with bright synths going back and forth with more bass-oriented ones. And the second drop goes for more of a throwback electro house production, which I think is also pretty great. This is one of those tracks that I knew would make my list from the moment I heard it, and I don't think it's hard to see why. Number 6. So in my NCS video for last year, I said this. If anything, it has generally felt a bit difficult to get trap music right as of late, and that's from someone who really enjoyed listening to trap back then. And since then, trap music has found a bit of a resurgence, namely through the likes of Isonoc and other young talents. But the thing about trap is, you don't always have to play the aggressive route. Why not play chess while everyone else plays checkers? This might not be the most expected pick. I mean, Garage 17 certainly wasn't, but it was another one of those that simply stood out the most from its respective album. I could go one step further and say that this might be the most tactical trap release I've heard in recent memory. From the ad-libs to the sliding bass to the dial tone, it's a really clean production in the first drop. And the second drop adds a bit more energy while still calling back some great elements from the first drop. The ending was a little bit messy, but the concept overall is excellent. This is basically everything that Uzi should have done in IBTFY. If you haven't paid attention to this one yet, well, why you stuttering for? It's worth a listen. Number 5. I think a lot of people will view August as one of, if not the worst month Monstercat has had in recent memory. And I guess it's down there for me, not just because of the Rhythm EPs, but there were some duds even outside of those. I genuinely think that the highlights we did have that month were really good. I mean, how often is it where we get 3 sort of out-of-nowhere collaborations, back-to-back by the way, and all 3 of which wind up being great? This one was the best of those 3, and easily the best for its respective month. I'm pretty sure I'm not alone in this one. Did I expect this track to top the best of 2024? Not really, but if that indicates one thing, it's that Skybreak was the best debutant of 2023. Sure, Diesel may have had his moment, but Skybreak had more of a long-term impact given his collaborations with artists like Chime, Cloud9, and Teminite. Now, Chill, on the other hand, was more of a mixed bag for me. I wasn't a big fan of her debut track Fool Me. I thought her remix of War was very unnecessary, but hey, at least Ignite was pretty good. And this track was weirdly just about what I expected, combining Chill's Speed House with Skybreak's color bass. It reminds me of 2 other tracks that made my best list last year. one of which was calling us by bad computer due to its unexpected use of the last drop, and the other was Ray Volpe's Drop 'Em for providing 3 distinct drops. The first drop took multiple listens to really click with me. I wasn't too sold with the vocal chops at first, but they do add some energy to the drop. The second drop utilizes more of Skybreak style with the color-based production. But the unexpected factor comes in that last drop, because who on earth expected a peak time techno switch up? And I like that it goes back into the style of the first drop with a harder hitting bass line. This might just be Chill's best release on the label so far, and I'm excited to see where both of these artists will take us next. Number 4. Okay, fine. I am finally going to put a boss fight track on this list proper. I started to understand the hype around him last year, namely through Buckshots and Revenge, but I'm realizing now that he's been fairly consistent in quality when it comes to his dubstep releases. That being said, I think I actually prefer when he releases something outside of dubstep. Take for example Fake, Grit, and this. So Boss Fight released only 2 tracks on Monstercat this year, this and Decimate, which I thought was a bit overrated. The first drop there did showcase his style well, but the second drop felt a bit awkward and slow paced. What I find interesting about Ballistic is that while the first drop here is bass house, it still utilizes Boss Fight's tear-up production very well. But even though I like the energy of the first drop, I think I might like the post drop even more. That Ghost Siren is just otherworldly, one of the absolute best moments of the year. And for the second drop, he takes a page out of Isonox playbook by going for some festival trap. The snare is pretty awesome, and the switch up is quite nice overall. Might not be as consistently good as the first drop, but that's just me being nitpicky. I'm hoping we get to see more of Boss Fight next year, but I guess this year may have been a case of quality over quantity. Even if I'm not as sold on Decimate as others were, this track makes up for it. Number 3. I have been waiting for this. I've been waiting for it from the moment I saw this artist set foot onto the label. But it's a little bit frustrating because if it weren't for a couple of elements, this track probably would have taken the number 1 spot. Nonetheless, I'm just going to say it, Jason Ross is the best debutant of 2024. The one thing I was anticipating most out of Jason Ross was his trance production. His hardstyle through his debut track No Tomorrow was a welcome surprise, and his melodic dubstep also does well to showcase his quality. But his style of trance stood out to me more than anything else, especially here since it's a bit rare these days. It makes perfect sense that the track that would stand out the most was his title track. Oriented more towards progressive house, or progressive trance if you want to call it that, the leads are simply emphatic, even outside of the drops. The sidechain helps strengthen the kick in the mix, and the production is just really strong overall. The one issue I have with it are the occasional vocal chops, especially near the beginning of the track. But overall, this is the sort of stuff I really want to see more of on the label. It's the best track from arguably the best EP this year. Number 2. As soon as I heard this track, I had it as the track to beat, mainly due to the star power and the story it tells. And although it did eventually fall back on me, it's still a dream collaboration. I haven't paid too much attention to Blank off the label, but here it feels like his magnum opus so far. Ever since making his debut last year, it seemed like this lad was always pushing for something more, even when he was already viewed as one of the highlights of Instinct. And having a collaboration with Grants is just surreal to witness. Now, this much star power usually comes with some high expectations, which of course they lived up to. The drops are a great combination of Blank's emphatic drum step and Grant's iconic vocal chop production. And if that isn't enough, how about the lyricism from Your Friend Pauly? I have such a soft spot for love songs where the artist is not only willing to celebrate someone at their best, but they're also willing to mourn with them and care for them at their worst. That just makes love seem much more heartfelt and genuine. So the question from here is, what could possibly be better? And before I answer that question, I want to take a moment to advertise my other channel. Recently, I released my first Animal Crossing video over there, so feel free to check it out if you haven't already. With that being said, it's finally time to move on to number 1. I don't often pay attention to the concept of a summer jam, especially not this year since I had summer classes for the first time. Now, what were the main summer jams in the mainstream? Well, where do I even begin? You've got Not Like Us by Kendrick Lamar, I Had Some Help by Post Malone and Morgan Wallen, a bar song by Shaboozey, Espresso by Sabrina Carpenter I think was up there. But what exactly makes a summer jam in the EDM scene? And from there, who would provide it on the Monstercat label? Well, this year, it really wasn't going to be anybody else but Conro. This year might be Conro's best yet, at least of recent memory. Even with 2022 and Just One Love in mind, this year really felt like a special one for him, mainly due to the Violet Sky EP, one of my favorites on Monstercat and one of his most personal ones. And some of those tracks were dedicated to his daughter. But if I had to pick the track that stood out from Conro the most this year, it would be the one single that wasn't from that EP. The main reason why it takes the top spot is because whatever concept he was trying to execute, I don't think he could have done any better. For this track, Conro brings along Harris, which is already pretty crazy. Given that this guy collaborated with Hardwell at one point, the breaks are a bit more pop-oriented, and the guitars remind me of Two Door Cinema Club of all things. And the drops remain a bit more guitar-oriented, at least it sounds like a guitar, but the bright synth around it is absolutely fantastic. What I really like about the chord progression here is that it starts off simple before Conro adds in some flair and detail as the drop continues. And let's not forget that the hook is quite infectious as well. The production as a whole is an absolute earworm, and that is why Nothing on You by Conro and Harris is the best Monstercat track of 2024. And that will wrap up this video. Let me know of your favorites and least favorites in the comments below. And if you guys enjoyed, feel free to like this video and subscribe to the channel. And I'll talk to you in the next video.